Welcome back to Relativity Fest 2020. Today, we're talking about RSMF. If you don't know what RSMF is, it is Relativity Short Message Format designed to organize your text messages in a nice, presentable way so your reviewers could make sense of your data. As you can see, I have a headset on. That means there is a guest on this video. So let me introduce you to Scott from Relativity. Scott, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, Nick. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thank you for agreeing to do this video with me. I have some really hard questions for you, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion this morning.
Good. I don't like softball questions, so hopefully we can add a lot of value to the discussion and users of RSMF today.
Awesome. Let's do it. So first, I want to start a little bit with adoption of RSMF, and I want to quickly tell you how it looked on my side, and then you can share your perspective from Relativity side.
Yeah.
So when RSMF format was announced and it was available for developers to test, I started building my application message crawler and creating these RSMF load files, and I started showing them to people like, hey, check it out, this is so cool. And people weren't like, whatever. And no one was sort of interested. So I kind of put my project on hold. I put my application on the website and just kind of let it sit there. And then a few months later, people started asking me like, hey, you have that conversion tool, right? I'm like, oh yeah, well now you remembered, right? So then people started to get some interest into it. And this is when I went to like phase 2 of the development where people actually would download and use it and give me like feedback, and the interest started like growing. So I'm wondering, how did you see adoption of RSMF file format from Relativity standpoint? Was it like no interest in it going up, or is there some other trend that you've seen?
Yeah. So I think, in enterprise software in general, as you probably well know, on your side, adoption doesn't happen maybe overnight with some of these things. There's a lot of marketing juice that needs to be behind it. Your buyers and users tend to be different. So I think this was the exact same case with RSMF, where we had a big launch. We had a lot of early adopters for sure, and to maybe describe the curve of the adoption that we've been seeing is similar to what you were saying. Is we had a lot of really interested parties. They're trying to figure out how it fit, and in context relative to what their business was, what their current state of their business was. Did they have cases with short message, were they just tinkering around with it? And so we saw a pretty steady increase that we were relatively happy with, but it really started to increase at the end, I would say, end of last year. It started to go a little bit more exponential coming into the year. And then, as you can imagine, in this new work from home world, the amount of data that we're creating via non-email and whatnot has just exploded, and we've seen that as well. So call it since March or May, we've seen 3 to 4 times, now probably 4 times the amount of data in just a matter of months than we saw previously. So it's blew out our expectations for the year in terms of the amount of data that we would have expected, which is good and bad. But in the same vein, we're excited to see that people are actually using it and using tools like Message Caller to get the data into Relativity.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues is also figuring out what the workflow is going to be. Do I create RSMF files right away? Do I review the text messages and then make them? Like, what are the steps? I think those are some of the questions people had and tried to figure that out for themselves.
Absolutely, and I think we absolutely could have done a better job. I'm always very critical of my own decisions, but we could have done a better job for sure. That was a lot of the calls that we took early on, was just how should our workflow change? What if we have all this data up front, but then we don't later down the line, once we have it ready for review, maybe it's too much. Trying to figure out where from a collection perspective to a conversion perspective to a review perspective, what are the options that people have? Because it is, let's call it what it is. It's a brand new set of data that people aren't used to really working through, not just the RSMF format, but these JSON XML files that are being exported in mass from Teams, Slack, etc., Bloomberg, especially since COVID. So I think the good news with all of this, as we talk about adoption and overcoming some of those hurdles and workflows, is I would ease some people's concerns and also get them excited with two little facts is, we've seen right now over 40 different chat platforms. So Slack, Teams, and Jabber, Yammer, some of the ones that I've barely ever heard of, converted into RSMF. So and people have done reviews on them. So I think that's great, right? That was the whole goal of RSMF is, there's thousands of chat platforms out there, and to review these, and they're all built differently. There's no email, HTML standard by any means. They're all built differently. So converging them into one format will give you more, as Relativity builds more tools on top of the viewer. I think the picture will start to become clear as to how, now you can start viewing some of these different platforms really in the same format, and helps run reviews more effectively and efficiently. And the second tidbit I would say is, and we'll talk about later, is just some of the things that we're thinking about that will make the reviews easier and help with those workflows that some people were a little unsure of going into using RSMF.
Yeah, I really like how you took all the different platforms and all the different data structures and what the RSMF does, and it makes it all uniform, so you back to one sort of standardized file format. So let's talk about future. Let's talk about RSMF 2.0. I know specifications came out. I read some of them. I have my opinion on some of them, which we'll talk about. The first question that came to my mind is RSMF 2.0 compatible with, let's say, Relativity Server? Will there going to be compatibility issues if somebody starts to generate RSMF 2.0? Will they still be able to use it? Are there going to be any problems there? How do you see this implementation going?
Yeah, I think the good news for users is that our absolute intent is to make sure that 2.0 is backwards compatible with 1.0 from a viewer perspective and a data spec perspective. I think we tried to, and when building out the RSMF spec for 1.0, we tried to make it, again, very broad, and we were probably a little bit too strict on some of the requirements that people had. And I think it just, as people tried to convert things into RSMF, whether it was Celebrite or whomever, we just ran into a fair amount of data collection scenarios that people haven't really run into, I would say, from a Relativity perspective in the past. Just with people deleting messages from their phone before it's collected. There's some information that's there, there's some that's not. There's just so many different scenarios that I think we need to take into account, largely from like a mobile phone perspective. I would say is where a lot of the inspiration for version 2.0 came about. So I think the intent is to be backwards compatible, and I think going forward we hope to be a little bit more flexible with what data is available and comes in, so you can review it without like totally failing processing or failing the viewer or whatnot, just so again you see what data is in there, and we'll give you hopefully options so you can say I want very strict data requirements to make sure that all this data is there, and if it's missing, don't allow it to be a valid file. Or be as, again, those mobile collection scenarios allow it to be validation to be more flexible. Mm-hmm. So you can, where your data is going to be a little messier and more incomplete, and still pass, validation and get into review and processing, and have those both handle that file.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that jumped out at me when I was reading 2.0 specs, is you made a lot of fields optional, which will help more types of data to be compatible with RSMF. So I guess that certainly does make sense. And I did notice that you've added number of fields as well, because RSMF, again, if you want to add additional metadata that's not doesn't have specific fields, you can always add them to like other props. But that's not always easiest fields to use. You have to like hover over question mark, and then all the fields pop up. And I'm glad you are adding like custodian, application, participants, attachment counts, all those fields get added. One interesting field that people have asked me about is a direction field. And at first, I've seen that field before in different exports, but then I kind of started thinking about it, and direction field is specific to individual user. So if me and another person were exchanging messages and we collect data from both phones, and we have a same message on both, and one will say incoming, that one will say outgoing. So could that be sort of confusing, or perhaps even interfere with trying to deduplicate text messages?
No, I think these are questions I think we're constantly poring over on our side. I think the good news is, right, as we start thinking about making these things optional, right, we hope to introduce less risk by making, again, more fields available to you in the spec if, again, they're available in the app. So, namely, so when we talk about direction, WhatsApp is a common, read receipts and direction, you get a lot of that data from WhatsApp and chats is where those come in. And I would say, the intent with adding direction was really around some of the requirements, SEC DOJ have with directions. So it helps to better infer from their production perspective, what was actually sent by someone and what was received from someone, and starts to get to what you alluded to, that piece of metadata in a production that would indicate, okay, this wasn't probably collected from their phone, but this person sent it. So it wasn't, that particular person's account where it was selected. So I think maybe the short answer is here, again, it's probably more of a mobile phone collection type of data point where you can start to infer with some direction data that, okay, without knowing how it was collected, I can start inferring that, okay, all these messages were collected from a certain person or people's phones.
Yeah, and you have a custodian field here as well. So if you combine custodian with direction, it actually would make sense because direction would be from the perspective of that custodian. However, another question comes to my mind is how will custodian information inside the RSMF conflict with custodian information assigned during processing? Again, I don't know if you have any insight on that. I know version 2.0 specs haven't been finalized, but I'm asking you just because I have this question in my head right now.
Yeah, sure. As of right now, we haven't, I guess the way I'd answer that is we are actually, working pretty closely with processing for version 2.0. I don't think the timing will line up with some of the improvements we want processing to make for RSMF, but I think maybe the short answer here is I think there's a fair amount of known work that we need to do on a processing side from RSMF, from an RSMF perspective, to, again, not just handle these types of scenarios, but also extract a lot more metadata from the file itself. As of today, for those of you that are or are not aware, there's relatively minimal metadata that's extracted by processing today, and we can chat about that later more in depth. But I think that's I think the good news here is I think we can kind of control our destiny to help rectify some of those scenarios by improving processing up front. So I think we'll be in a good spot, hopefully in the next year, with the spec and processing being making potentially some updates. So not making any promises, but that's our intent and our goal is to make that much smoother.
Yeah, no,
going forward.
That's good. I definitely like where it's heading. Is there anything that you specifically excited about version 2.0 of the specs? Anything that you always wanted to make sure specs have, and now you finally got a chance to kind of implement it, or anything that you find exciting?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I find exciting, and this may be me nerding out or geeking out a little bit, is we have people, we spend some of our time, not all of our time, some of our time just researching some of the newer platforms that that are coming out, or people are raising to us as, how do I get this in RSMF? Ones that may be less common, for I would say the most enterprise or enterprise users. And I think that's been the most exciting part, is as we continue to do some of the research on some of these platforms, we find some of these unique features that are used in, I'm just going to throw out Facebook Messenger, for example. They have this concept of stickers, which are not like emoticons, they're not emojis, they're not GIFs or GIFs, they're not
something
pictures.
In between.
There's something in between. So, from our perspective, we want to think about adding some of those unique features, but again, not swaying the spec so much where you are, overcorrecting for one. So short answer here is I think what I'm excited about is after doing all that research, we added, a fair amount of I would say generic fields that help users transform data into the spec without, again, making it a Facebook Messenger specific spec or a Slack specific spec on a certain version of Slack. I think that's what I'm most excited about is the broadness, the breadth that we added to the spec, but also in terms of our platform, chat platform perspective. But I think the second thing I'm most excited about is as we start to improve the end-to-end experience with the improved validation tools, improved viewer imaging and error handling. I think hopefully we are able to put a nice bow on version 2, because again, version 1 was a version 1. There's a lot of things left to be desired, and I think we got plenty of good feedback from partners like yourself to make it better, cleaner version 2. So, and I'm sure when version 2 comes out, there'll be plenty of other feedback to think about as well. But I think
I'm sure there will be.
We've gotten, but I think this is we've let it bake for about a year, and I think version 1 for about a year, and I think now we're excited to hear what people think of version 2.
Perfect. So the most important question: when will it be finalized, the version 2 spec?
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, I hope that we are getting close. Hopefully by the end of the year is what would be my rough timing, where we have finalization. We've been passing the spec around to customers and partners like yourself just to get some insight as to what we're missing, what they're seeing a lot of. And I think the good news is for partners like yourself and customers, we've incorporated a lot of that feedback. We're not turning a blind eye to it, but we're also trying to make hard decisions, right? What is, where do we want to go with a viewer, and how does that spec line up? Some of these requests for the spec line up with that. The good news is I think we've as I mentioned, we've incorporated a lot of that feedback, and I think directionally, partners like yourself you start to see it and you get it, which is great. But I think we're hopefully by the end of the year we have something that is set in stone, and we're starting to put fingers to keyboards to get it something out sooner than later.
Yeah, by the end of the year sounds good, and I totally understand it's not an easy project. It's not something that you just make up and say, okay, done, here it is. There are multiple teams within Relativity. There are multiple departments, like processing engine has to support it, viewer has to support it. So all these different pieces have to play alone, and it has to be consistent and supported by all the aspects of Relativity. Imaging has to be able to image it, right? So it's not just like in its own bubble, it's across the whole Relativity environment.
You got it. Yeah. That's the beautiful mess that I think is good. I think we have done a good amount of sharing of this spec as well. Although I tend to focus on the viewer, chatting with processing and imaging on this, I think we're all aligned. It's again, having all those forces come together at the right time to get something out, I think is the next step here.
Great. So I have additional question that that goes with something that was promised a little while ago and is being a little bit delayed. And one of the features that my clients are looking for, or everyone's looking for, I would say, is ability to filter on certain messages. But after they filtered for them, which is functionality that exists right now in Relativity 1, right? You can filter by date, by participants, but then they want to freeze that conversation. They want to say, okay, I found them, I found my messages, I want to image them just like in my filter, or they want to save it like that. And I believe this is something you were referring to before as a slicing tool or slicing workflow. Can you give us a little bit more info as to how that's coming along?
Yeah. I think from our perspective, we last few months, I would say, we've done some pretty heavy prototyping with customers across many different personas, from lit support analysts to end user attorneys, and we've gotten a pretty good plan in place, and we're actually in the middle of planning in this feature out. So our intent is to begin work on this within the next few weeks, which is great. I think from our perspective, and for those, and I think you set up the problem perfectly, is okay, I'm in a big RSMF file that might span many weeks or days or whatnot. And now, to your point, we have the filtering functionality, but that's all it really is more of an investigative type of tool. Now, how can I like lift just those messages that I care about to then only produce those messages that matter?
Yep.
And code them that matter, the ones that matter. And that's exactly what the intent of slicing is. Okay, great, I've got all those messages. I'm going to take some wide swaths with my filtering capabilities to like narrow it down by day. And then I also want to then dig down by specific messages to then pull those out and act on those. So, I've heard some folks during prototypes talk about it, similar to document unitization, because again, the whole user prototyping was really around making sure defensibility was first and foremost thought about. And the good news is, from all of our user tests, people understand that as long as the original RSMF is not touched in any way, shape, or form, and you can trace back to the original RSMF, there should be no concern. So I think our intent is to have, you would have that original RSMF, make the selections of the messages that you cared about, and you'd essentially be copying out those specific messages and attachments, to its own new file, and again, easily link back to the parent file where those came from.
Yeah, I think workflow like that is what a lot of people are looking for. I think the last thing is, if you want to share any other improvements that we didn't cover, what are you looking to improve in the future? What are the things you're doing?
Yeah. I think, you touched on a little bit before, Nick, about just how many different teams are involved in the end-to-end process here. And, all of them work to hone their craft, which is awesome. We have experts in each of these areas, and that's great, because some of these areas, personally for me, I'll raise my hand, some of the processing problems that come up are just over my head. So kudos to that team. But I think the two things that come up in my mind, we alluded to a little bit before, was improvements to processing. That'd be one thing that I'm pretty excited about. I don't know, again, can't communicate timing per se, but I know it's been a pretty big concern from some customers who have super large RSMF files. That could be for pretty simple reasons, as like, okay, Nick, you and I had a 10-year conversation, and my mobile extraction tool exports all 10 years of that, and maybe we just shared huge movie files between us for 10 years, and you end up with hundreds of gigabytes in just one RSMF file. So giving people some tools to be able to better process those large files, I think, is really the intent of the processing improvements. Really improving that RSMF handler, which for all intents and purposes should be able to process those large short message chats, which again are going to be much larger than maybe a typical email chain or chat.
I have an idea. How about slicing as you process? So this way, how about that? It just popped into my head. So you just say, like, I don't want any RSMF files over 300 megabytes. If processing engine finds them, just chop them up.
Totally. And we've had part of our user prototyping with slicing in the viewer was people brought that up as well. And it's definitely something on processing's radar for sure, because if you can do some of that culling, if you can't do the culling from the collection, right, and now you just have these large RSMF files, that's also a smart place to make sure you can be a little bit more surgical of, okay, I don't care about this 2-year time frame, but I just care about like the 12-month time frame within that 2-year time frame. And just, again, reducing burden on reviewers is really the intent. So I think it's an idea that has been floated around by us internally and has been echoed by folks like yourselves. So I think it's something we definitely want to, we have processing definitely looking into ways to make that happen.
Awesome. And you're also working on some features to automatically collect data from like Slack and Teams and just pull that into RSMF. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I can't speak to it totally, but going back to the many teams in Relativity, for folks that use Relativity 1, they might be familiar with our collect tool. And again, the collect tool is largely for collection directly from cloud native data sources. So again, Office 3, Microsoft Office 365, et cetera. So I think it will help with a fair amount of collections from in this case Slack and Teams, but there's also a lot of nuance with these types of collections, right? So you have Slack. We'll just stick with that example. Depending on the paid plan that you have for Slack, if it's like, I forget the tiers, there's maybe like 3
I know
tiers.
there's like an enterprise and professional.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, the collect team is probably better versed in this than I am, but it's something like only if you have the enterprise level of Slack do you actually get their discovery API, which allows you to even like pull all the information out of Slack that you want. Whereas like these lower tiers, like you may not get anything, or you might even just get a fraction of the data. I'm not totally sure.
I believe those export to JSON, and then they give you a link to attachment. But if you're in an enterprise, you don't actually get a link to attachment, and you need to use the collect API. So they made it a little bit more confusing than I would like.
Right. Yeah. And as we all know, I mean, this isn't a ding on the e-discovery on maybe on software providers in general, but it's like Slack. That's probably one of the last features that they thought of was like it was pulling data out of their tool. So I get it, but I think to your point, I think they could make it easier, but in the meantime, right? Until they change those tiers that they have and what features and functionality are available, the Slack collection will be just for the people that have the enterprise API for Slack, so they can directly pull it into Relativity, and the collect team will be doing all that RSMF conversion for you. And they're actively working on that as well. So I think the good news is, right, make it easier, make Slack collection for Slack and Teams easier for some, but again, you're going to have customers that don't have the Slack enterprise API or Teams or G Suite like enterprise grade, where you may not be able to directly pull all the data that you need, and you will need to have a pretty raw export that you will need somehow to be converted into RSMF for it to be reviewed. So creating plenty of opportunities for them to reach out to folks like yourself to help with conversions there.
Yeah, I think that's good. Sounds good, and I'm looking forward to all the new features in RSMF and to see what you guys will implement in the future. For our viewers, if you want to learn more about RSMF, feel free to reach out to Relativity, to your rep, or if you're working with a service provider, they'll be happy to demonstrate it for you. It's a really cool way of looking at your text messages. And if you want to know how to create those RSMF files, well, then you need to reach out to me and check out Message Crawler, which is a tool that can take DAT files, Slack. It also actually supports Teams data now, and it will generate those RSMF files that you can load to Relativity and have a totally different review experience than you would get if you just imported DAT files straight into, well, your Relativity workspace. All right, Scott, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be talking more and hopefully learning more about new features as I add the 2.0 specs to Message Crawler.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.